Peter, much of your research focuses on carbon capture and storage. What do you see as the promising developments here? What should we be following? I find myself getting more and more interested in this area as Washington gets less interested in policy.
Well, I do think actually, you know, the great machine of government is rolling forward. And so just in the past couple of months, some of the big carbon capture and storage projects that were started in the Obama administration have reached milestones where they're injecting, or they're getting to rates where they'd be injecting 1 million tons a year. And the Republican governors of Indiana and Ohio both just signed legislation that will require the states to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in the next couple decades. So whatever we may be hearing from Washington, which isn't a totally clear message yet, a lot of good things continue to go forward. So those are things to watch. I think there is a perception that's a little bit more problematic on the part of industry, for example, that, oh, well, we know how to do this, and so we're just going to sit on the sidelines and wait until it pays, until there's a carbon tax or something. That's a little more insidious. It is the case that oil and gas companies inject globally about somewhere between 10 and 30 million tons of CO2 per year for enhanced oil recovery, so they certainly know how to get CO2 in the ground, but they also recover most of that with the produced oil and gas. There's only somewhere between 2 and 4 projects that were for carbon storage that are injecting at a rate of 1 million tons a year. And just to put that in perspective, in order to take up 10% of human emissions annually, we'd need 4,000 of those plants operating simultaneously. So there's a huge distance from where we are to where we would need to be. And indeed, one of the bigger projects, they cracked the cap rock. And so they had to stop injecting, and we don't really know how common that sort of event is going to be. I'd say from a purely sanguine point of view, as a scientist, if CO2 storage reservoirs leak a little bit, that's not a big deal. As long as we inject 100 times faster than they leak, it's really not terribly important. It's not particularly dangerous. And again, in the United States, a very, very high standard was set. I forget exactly, but like 99% retention over 50 years or something like that. Well, if you set that kind of objective, it's very, very difficult to even verify whether you've achieved it, and it becomes very expensive. So it'd be great if we could relax a little bit about that. As far as CCS goes in general, or carbon capture and storage goes in general, there's a big focus on the cost, and that's very well justified. So that the IPCC several years ago, for certain kinds of carbon capture and storage, they suggested it might double the cost of a power plant, and that obviously that's significant. The costs are coming down, but another really important aspect of this is just philosophy and societal points of view, so that what's it worth? And in that context, it's very, very important that the previous administration did studies of the so-called social cost of carbon. I think they did a great job. I'm amazed to say this. I think the White House did better than any of the previous academic studies of potential damage due to adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. There's beautiful diagrams with probability distributions and so on that are so much more meaningful than a saying it's exactly $40 a ton. And in that context, to the extent that that allows us to see what should a carbon tax be, what are different mitigation methods really worth to us, this is tremendously important. And I note that the Trump administration has canceled ongoing studies of the social cost of carbon. So that's for sure something to watch.
Related to that, I live in Washington, so I'm very Washington focused in my thinking, but one of the big concerns I'm hearing is just about government research and funding for climate science across the board. What influence do you think potential cuts there will have, and what are you hearing from colleagues who either work in government science or are funded by government science programs in terms of what kind of impact this will have?
Well, I'll respond to that, and then maybe Adam can jump in. But first of all, nothing's sure yet, and there's a lot of momentum and friction in the government system that will probably limit the cuts to some degree. And so you hear fairly You hear lobbyists and other people who are very familiar with the legislative process saying, don't worry too much yet. But on the other hand, there are some programs within the U.S. research edifice that are being specifically targeted. And so being calm about the overall fate of the president's budget is one thing, but knowing that House Science and Technology Committee has recommended basically cutting all climate science research and moving NASA's Earth observing program entirely to planetary exploration, you know, those are the things to watch. And it may be that if they can isolate the climate science community and, you know, for example, fund NIH, they might succeed in some of these more targeted cuts. And again, that's something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, the statements of intent, I agree with everything Peter just said, but just to elaborate a little more. The statements of intent coming out of some parts of Congress, the House Science Committee, as well as the Trump administration, some of the things they've said they intend to do are pretty bad and would do lasting harm to climate science. I really worry, even if a fraction of that were to happen, it would have a really destructive effect on our, a lot of research at government labs and at universities, and I worry about the effect of young scientists coming into the field. You know, we could lose some very talented people who would choose other careers who we might otherwise attract into this field, and we need climate science to tell us what's happening and what will happen for the future. The science keeps evolving quickly, and we can't have science and foreign policy without the science. So it's true. The worst stuff being proposed probably won't happen in the full depth of its badness, but even a modest fraction of it would do serious harm, and so I really hope it doesn't happen. But as Peter rightly said, nothing's happened yet, and as far as our colleagues in government labs, I think they're all just waiting and seeing with a great deal of concern, but not panic just yet, for the most part.